Hey everyone, this is Zach with 8020 Media, here today with a video on the BMW M2 versus M3 and M4. Previously, I filmed a video comparing the BMW M3 and M4 and ultimately came to the conclusion that the M3 and M4 are virtually identical cars, less their door count, with the BMW M3 being a sedan and the BMW M4 being a coupe. One thing important to note before jumping into all the specifics of this comparison between the BMW M2, M3, and M4 is that I will mostly be referencing the newest chassis and newest variants of these models. So looking at the G80 M3, G82 M4, and the G87 M2. However, I will also reference the previous generation F chassis cars a few times just to paint the full picture and the full comparison between the BMW M2, M3, and M4. So starting off with engines and performance, all of these M cars are really all in the same ballpark. Looking at the G chassis, they all receive the exact same BMW S58 3-liter twin turbocharged inline-6 engine. Now, the M2 does receive a slightly detuned variant coming in at 453 horsepower compared to the 473 to 503 horsepower engine that the M3 and M4 receive. However, it's important to note that this S58 between all of these models is identical. Mechanically, it's the exact same engine. So ultimately, if you looked into tuning any of these cars and doing any kind of aftermarket modifications, they all have the same end potential, and the power gains on the M2 are just going to look a little bit more impressive since, again, it has a lower starting point. One thing to note specifically with the older generations, when we look back to the introduction of the BMW M2, the F87 M2, that vehicle was actually initially released with the BMW N55 engine, a slightly upgraded and different variant of the N55. However, at that time, the BMW M3 and M4 were using BMW M's S55 engine. So unfortunately, the M2 at first did get a slightly worse engine and didn't get the true BMW M engine in it. However, BMW did end up introducing the F87 M2 competition model, which did feature the S55 engine. And much like the case with the newer S58, it was a slightly detuned variant of what the M3 and M4 received, but mechanically the exact same engine. Looking at performance, could sit here and throw out a bunch of different 0 to 60 times, quarter mile times, etc. However, these cars are actually all very close, and a lot of it really just boils down to external factors on the day that the vehicles are tested: temperature, weather, the driver, transmission, so on and so forth. But everything else the same. The M2, M3, and M4 all delivered nearly the exact same performance. Now, with that said, the M3 and M4 do actually have a slight advantage, and the reason for that being that the M3 and M4 are available as competition X-Drive models. So any of these competition X-Drive models come in at 503 horsepower compared to the 453 horsepower M2. So they have a 50 horsepower advantage right off the bat. And on top of that, that all-wheel drive system is really going to help with traction and starting times. So when you look at those competition X-Drive models for the G80 M3 and G82 M4, they're actually going to be a decent bit quicker than the smaller G87 M2. To throw out a couple numbers to paint that picture, the M3 and M4 all-wheel drive models are capable of hitting 0 to 60 miles an hour in about 2.8 seconds. On the other hand, the M2 is going to be looking at about 3.4 to 3.6 seconds. So that is a pretty significant advantage to 60 miles an hour because of that X-Drive system available on the M3 and M4 competition models. Moving on to the size and space of the BMW M2 versus M3 and M4. Of course, this is where the M2 is really going to have its biggest disadvantage. The M2 is really meant to be more of a true coupe sports car and much less of a family car or any kind of commuter. So the M3 the four-door sedan, is going to have the clear advantage here. When I talked about the M3 versus M4 in the previous video, that was really the biggest benefit of the M3, is that having those two extra doors can be very helpful if you have a family or tend to transport a lot of passengers in general. Obviously, that extra door count is helpful, and the M3 compared to the M4 also has more space in the rear seats. There's more headroom in the rear seats. There's more cargo and trunk space in the BMW M3 compared to the M4. And in the case of the M2, it's just even smaller than the M4 with the same two-door count, and is going to have even less room in the back seats. And so the M2 is mostly targeted at being a two-door car. Now, sure, if you have a family with younger kids, you can probably fit them in the back seat of the M2 without any real complaints or real issues. But if you are trying to fit 4 adults in the vehicle, in the M2, it is going to get a little bit cramped. You could even say the same thing for the larger M4. So ultimately, that's going to be the biggest disadvantage for the M2. Of course, only a disadvantage if you do really need the extra space. However, if you're looking for a vehicle mostly for yourself and just something to have fun driving and you don't need the extra space, then that could very well be an advantage of the M2. But with that said, its smaller size and dimensions are what really gives it a big advantage in this next category we're going to be talking about, and that is going to be handling and feel. So looking at a couple specs quickly, the G80 M3 and G82 M4 both have a wheelbase of 112.5 inches, whereas the G87 M2 has a wheelbase of 108.1 inches, so just about 4.5 inches shorter of a wheelbase. Look at that alongside the length, of which the G82 M4 has a length of just over 189 inches, and the M2 is going to have a length just over 180 inches, so about a 4.5 inch difference in wheelbase and a 9-inch difference in the overall length of the vehicle. And that is something that you are really going to feel, especially when driving the car and tossing it around corners. The M2 is just going to feel a lot smaller. It's going to feel just a lot more of a nimble vehicle in general around the corners. And so that is a big advantage to the M2, is it's truly just going to feel like a sportier, more nimble car. Unfortunately for the M2, that sportier feeling doesn't actually translate to any significantly better real-world results. And a lot of that probably does boil down to the weight of the G87 M2. Much like a lot of newer vehicles, all of these M cars are pretty heavy considering they are supposed to be performance cars and great handling cars. Looking at the G82 M4 and even the G80 M3, which barely weighs more than the M4, these vehicles are going to tip the scales around 3,700 to 3,920 pounds. The lower end is going to be your manual examples with just rear-wheel drive, and the heavier examples pushing about 3,900 pounds are going to be the competition X-Drive models with the 8-speed automatic transmissions. The M2, on the other hand, comes in around 3,700 to 3,800 pounds. So if you look at a similarly equipped M2, M3, or M4, there really isn't any weight advantage to the M2, even though it is a smaller car, has a shorter wheelbase and a shorter overall length. It still weighs just about the same as an M3 or M4. Ultimately, when that comes to track times and actual lap times, especially considering the power disadvantage from the factory of the M2, that actually leads to both the BMW M3 and M4 posting better lap times than the M2. Now again, that does have a clear advantage in the sense that it does have the all-wheel drive system and 503 horsepower. Anyway, guys, that wraps up our video for today. If you appreciated the content, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and check out the description below for more. Thanks, everyone.